The morning fog over the Chatham County pines swallowed the world by 7, leaving gray silhouettes and the slow drip of condensation from the oak leaves. I stood by the kitchen window with a mug of black coffee, watching the charcoal gray SUV of my daughter-in-law, Catherine, disappear around the bend of our gravel driveway. She had kissed my cheek precisely at 6:30, smelling of expensive French perfume, announcing that her international flight to Zurich for the Global Medical Investment Summit would keep her away for 12 days. Her leather luggage had been lined up by the front door 48 hours early, tagged with gold initials, KVC. Everything she touched was cataloged, controlled, and presented with the theatrical precision of a woman who wanted the neighborhood to witness her tireless devotion to a paralyzed husband. For 5 years, my retirement had been measured by the rigid rhythm of a sick room. My son, Ethan, 40 years old, was once an architect whose structural drawings commanded admiration across Atlanta. Then came a rainy night on Interstate 16, a freight truck sliding across wet asphalt and a crushed T10 vertebra that doctors initially promised was temporary. Within 72 hours, Catherine had taken absolute command. She brought in a private neurology consultant from Boston, a smooth specialist who reviewed the scans for 20 minutes and returned with a somber verdict: permanent nerve damage, irreversible paraplegia, zero chance of recovery. I believed him. I was a retired forensic auditor who spent 30 years tracing hidden ledger balances, not a neurologist. Catherine handled the paperwork, insurance payouts, and daily care regimen with an efficiency that wrung tears of gratitude from my eyes. I moved into their guest room that same month. Every morning at 6, I watched Catherine prepare Ethan's morning smoothie with the tender, exaggerated care of a saintly wife. She measured out his morning medications, what she called essential nerve stabilizers, and handed him the glass with a gentle smile. By 9, Ethan's eyes would grow foggy, his head would loll against the headrest, and by noon he was invariably asleep, lost in a heavy chemical haze I naively attributed to grief. The house operated like a well-oiled machine under Catherine's governance. The quiet that settled into the kitchen after her SUV rounded the corner this morning should have felt relief. Instead, it was the eerie calm before a structural collapse. I took a sip of my coffee, looking out at the empty driveway. There were no clipboards waiting on the island, no sticky notes stuck to the refrigerator. For 12 days, the house belonged to us. I planned to help Ethan onto the back porch later, far away from the rigid schedules. Then came the sound at 7:48. It wasn't the rubber-padded whisper of wheelchair wheels on hardwood. It was heavier, denser, and fundamentally wrong. It was the distinct sound of a human shoulder violently striking a drywall partition, followed by a sharp intake of air and a bone-jarring thud that rattled the framed blueprints in the corridor. My instincts, forged over 30 years of auditing hidden corporate crimes where people lied with a straight face, kicked in instantly. I didn't freeze. I moved toward the disturbance. I turned the corner from the kitchen into the main hallway, and my breath caught violently in my throat. I stopped so abruptly my slippers skidded across the polished wood. Ethan was standing. Both palms were pressed flat against opposite walls of the narrow corridor, his arms trembling like overloaded load-bearing beams supporting a weight they hadn't felt in 60 months. His legs, those wasted limbs I had lifted, positioned, and strapped into footrests for 1,825 consecutive days, were bent and shaking uncontrollably. They were pale and weak, but they were holding him. He breathed like a man breaking through the surface of deep water after minutes of drowning, each inhalation a desperate act of survival. His face was soaked in cold sweat, but his eyes, those eyes drowned in a chemical fog for half a decade, were wide, terrifyingly clear, and fiercely alive. Neither of us spoke for a long, tense second. "Mom," he rasped, his voice cracked from years of disuse, carrying an urgency that cut straight through my ribs. "We have to get out of this house right now, before the residual medication wears off." I didn't waste a second asking questions or weeping. 30 years of forensic investigation teach you one immutable law. When numbers don't add up and the mask slips, you secure the perimeter. I crossed the distance in 3 long strides, sliding my shoulder under his right arm, taking his weight as his knees buckled. He was heavier than I expected, but together we forged a slow, agonizing path down the hallway, every step a rebellion against 5 years of engineered captivity. I settled him into the passenger seat of my sedan parked in the garage, his chest heaving as he stared out at the trees. He looked like a man who had just escaped a maximum security prison. Sitting behind the steering wheel, I looked at my son's resolute profile, and the final puzzle pieces clicked into place. The dedicated wife who wore cream-grade luggage and managed multi-million-dollar portfolios wasn't a saint. She was an architect of a slow, meticulously planned execution, using a marriage certificate as a corporate license and a paralyzed husband as a living ghost to launder a fortune. And as I turned the ignition key, I knew our lives had changed forever. The sedan's engine hummed softly as I guided it away from the highway and down the overgrown gravel track leading to our old family property in rural Chatham County. For decades, this secluded timber barn had served as my husband's workshop, but after his passing, I had converted its subterranean root cellar into a secure, climate-controlled digital vault during my final years as a forensic auditor for the state. No glowing signs marked the entrance, and no digital footprints linked the structure to our current residence. It was an offline, heavily shielded archive designed to withstand everything except a direct lightning strike. As I cut the ignition, Ethan didn't wait for me to open his door. He gripped the frame, swung his legs out with a heavy thud against the floor mat, and pushed himself up. He was still shaking, his muscles burning from the sudden resurrection of movement, but adrenaline carried him across the threshold and down the concrete steps into the cool, shadowed quiet of the underground room. I unlocked the heavy steel door, flicked the master switch, and the servers hummed to life, casting a pale, clinical blue glow over rows of encrypted hard drives. This was where I had spent 30 years dissecting corporate deception and exposing white-collar criminals who thought they could outsmart the system. I never imagined the most devastating financial crime of my career would involve my own daughter-in-law, executed under my roof while I cooked her breakfast. Ethan walked stiffly over to the reinforced wall safe tucked behind a stack of weathered crates, his fingers tracing the digital dial. For 4 long years, while Catherine thought he was lost in a chemical fog of sedatives, his mind had remained razor-sharp, quietly cataloging every keystroke, phone call, and numerical slip she made. With a sharp click of the tumbler, the heavy steel door swung open. We didn't pull out dusty albums. We pulled out the raw blood of Catherine's empire: digital ledger exports, wire transfer receipts, and offshore asset statements. 5 years ago, after the truck accident on Interstate 16 crushed Ethan's spine, a civil settlement against the freight company had yielded a massive $14.5 million judgment. Catherine had wept in the hospital corridor, swearing on her mother's grave that the entire sum had been locked away in an untouchable medical trust dedicated exclusively to Ethan's lifelong care. I had trusted her tears, but numbers, unlike people, do not lie, weep, or manipulate. When I plugged my master auditing drive into the local terminal and pulled up the fragmented corporate trails, the true architecture of her betrayal laid itself bare across the monitor in cold, unyielding green text. The $14.5 million had never touched a medical trust. Within 72 hours of the settlement clearance, Catherine had systematically fractured the capital across a labyrinth of 5 shell corporations incorporated in Delaware and routed through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. She had used my son's broken body as startup capital to build a ruthless, independent real estate portfolio. As my eyes swept down the columns of data, the scale of her theft came into sharp focus. She was the sole beneficial owner of 4 high-end private assisted living facilities across the Southeast and commercial properties valued at nearly $20 million. While I spent 6 hours every morning sponge bathing my son, the woman sitting across from us at Sunday dinner was quietly laundering millions stolen from his catastrophe settlement. Yet, as horrifying as the financial pillaging was, it was nothing compared to what lay at the bottom of the safe. My gloved fingers pulled out a final manila folder labeled with a set of private insurance codes. Inside was a primary term life insurance policy underwriting Ethan's life for exactly $10 million, naming Catherine as the sole beneficiary. Clipped to the back of the policy was a single printed email originating from a prominent neurological institute in Boston, dated just 4 days before Catherine's Zurich trip. The text was chilling. The formal documentation for a manufactured diagnosis of progressive neurological degeneration was fully prepared and awaiting her final signature. The estimated timeline for total biological collapse and quiet expiration was explicitly calculated down to a 30-day window. Ethan stared at the glowing monitor, his face tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the desk. He didn't cry. His voice was as cold and precise as an architect's blueprint when he looked down at the execution order bearing his wife's name. "She wasn't just planning to keep the money, Mom," he said quietly, his eyes reflecting the blue light. "She was cleaning up the final loose end so she could inherit it all without a witness." I set the folder down, feeling a strange stillness settle over my bones. We weren't dealing with a greedy relative anymore. We were dealing with a professional predator who had scheduled her husband's murder like a quarterly business review. And as I looked at the terminal screen, I knew standard justice was far too gentle. We needed an audit trail that would lock her away forever, and I knew down to the last cent how to build it. The digital vault was dead silent except for the low hum of the server fans. Outside, the wind rustled the pine boughs, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Ethan sat on a wooden stool near the terminal, his chest rising and falling as he stared into the dim space ahead. For 5 years, the world viewed him as a broken artifact of a highway tragedy, a man whose life ended on Interstate 16. But as the blue glow from the screen illuminated his face, the lines of exhaustion could not hide the steady clarity in his eyes. He knew the questions that hung heaviest between us, the silent doubts about how a man told he was permanently paralyzed could pull himself across a hallway floor. He began quietly, his voice carrying the measured cadence of an architect laying out structural flaws. "The accident 5 years ago was real," he explained, and the truck sliding across the rain-slicked highway had indeed crushed his T10 vertebrae. But the catastrophe was weaponized the moment the ambulance doors closed at St. Jude's Memorial Hospital. The public hospital's lead trauma surgeon had estimated a moderate spinal compression with a realistic probability of natural nerve regeneration within 18 months of therapy. That medical projection never reached official records. Catherine intercepted the consultation notes within 44 hours, pulled strings through private medical boards, and bribed the attending surgeon to alter the permanent classification to irreversible paraplegia, sealing his fate behind fabricated clinical certainty. The confinement that followed was a meticulously engineered chemical prison. Every morning at 6 sharp, Catherine played the part of the devoted wife, walking into his bedroom carrying a freshly squeezed glass of orange juice. She called it her special immunity booster, packed with vitamins and essential nerve stabilizers to combat muscle atrophy. In reality, it was a calculated cocktail of potent neurosuppressants and forced muscle relaxants designed to depress his central nervous system, cloud his cognition, and keep him trapped in a compliant fog. By mid-morning, his head would drop against the headrest, and by noon he was entirely lost to the world, unable to protest or resist. This invisible cage held firm for 4 years. The turning point arrived 12 months ago, born from a mundane technological oversight. Catherine had left her tablet synced to the household's central cloud network while stepping out for an errand. A routine background notification popped up on the shared screen, an unencrypted financial preview showing a multi-million-dollar offshore wire transfer. The sudden jolt of adrenaline acted like a biological shock, cutting through the pharmaceutical fog. For the first time in 4 years, his mind locked onto the data with the sharp focus of a man realizing he was being murdered from the inside out. He knew that showing any sudden lucidity would double his chemical dosage. That realization forced him into a silent strategy of deception, lasting an entire year. Every morning, when Catherine handed him the vitamin-laced juice, he would swallow just enough to maintain a believable grogginess, while secretly holding the bulk of the dense liquid in the back of his mouth. The moment she turned her back to rinse the glass, he would spit the residue down the sink. It was an agonizing withdrawal, fraught with spasms and severe nausea as the neurotoxins cleared from his bloodstream. Recovering his cognitive clarity was only half the battle. Rebuilding a withered body inside a house guarded by a predator required a ghost's discipline. While Catherine slept upstairs, Ethan spent the midnight hours pushing his body past endurance limits. When the house plunged into darkness at 2 in the morning, he would slide off the bed onto the floor, dragging his paralyzed limbs across the carpet. He practiced crawling along baseboards, gripping door frames, and forcing his atrophied leg muscles to bear weight against the walls during brief intervals when the chemical suppression was lowest. He did not obtain the house keys through espionage. They were recovered from a rusted metal hook in the back of the garage, a spare set left over from before the accident, secured during a rare night 4 years prior when Catherine had accidentally left his bedroom door unlocked, and he dragged himself into the hallway. He stopped speaking, the hum of the server racks filling the silence. He looked down at his trembling hands. "She thought she had built a cage with no doors, Mom," he said quietly, cutting through the damp air like cold steel. "She just forgot that architects know how to read the blueprints of the walls they're trapped inside." I looked at my son, feeling a profound wave of calm clarity wash away my grief. The man sitting before me was a survivor who had crawled out of his own grave. I closed the laptop lid, our next move already calculated down to the final detail. The blue light of the server terminal cast steady shadows across the concrete floor of the underground vault, reflecting a mind that had spent 30 years dissecting financial deception. Any ordinary person standing where we stood would have grabbed a phone, dialed 911, and demanded an immediate police raid. But panic is a luxury for the unprepared, and 30 years in forensic auditing had taught me a brutal truth. Rushing to law enforcement with raw anger and circumstantial claims is the fastest way to hand a sophisticated criminal an easy victory. If we had called the local sheriff or FBI field office that night without ironclad proof, Catherine's high-priced corporate defense attorneys would have weaponized the forged medical records from Boston. They would have painted Ethan as a cognitively impaired patient experiencing delusions, and me as a frantic, overprotective mother-in-law. To destroy an apex predator who hid behind legal facades, you do not attack with a blunt instrument. You trap them inside their own financial architecture. We needed evidence of systematic asset dissipation and coordinated white-collar fraud that no defense attorney could spin away as a domestic dispute. And the beauty of the multi-million-dollar empire Catherine had built on my son's ruin was that every single shell corporation, offshore wire transfer, and real estate acquisition was anchored to a digital paper trail. During my final active years with the State Oversight Division, my digital signature and legacy administrative credentials had remained quietly archived within the federal banking compliance grid, dormant but legally authorized under old family trust parameters that Catherine had never bothered to revoke, assuming I was nothing more than an aging, harmless retiree who cooked meals and washed sheets. With Ethan watching closely from his stool, his hands braced steadily against the edge of the metal desk, I sat before the encrypted terminal and executed a maneuver designed to strike at the absolute core of Catherine's greed. I did not notify local authorities. Instead, I initiated a federal emergency forensic audit targeting the entire network of 5 Delaware shell corporations and Cayman Islands accounts tied to her name. Through secure banking compliance protocols, I triggered an immediate automated administrative freeze on every single commercial property, bank account, and assisted living facility asset under her control, categorizing the massive capital influx under an urgent preliminary flag of international money laundering and civil asset forfeiture review. It was a calculated, lethal strike delivered silently through the veins of the global financial system. The system did not require human intervention to execute its next step. The moment the federal compliance flag locked down her corporate assets, the banking network's automated security architecture instantly generated an encrypted high-priority security alert and dispatched it directly to the secure mobile device Catherine carried with her abroad. It was designed to reach her wherever she was in the world within seconds. I pictured her sitting in some luxurious corporate boardroom or a high-end European hotel suite in Zurich, surrounded by medical investors, entirely confident in her absolute immunity. Then her phone would buzz. She would look down at the screen and watch her entire ill-gotten empire freeze in real time, her real estate portfolio locked tight under suspicion of federal financial crimes. It was a trap built specifically for her psychology. Catherine was not a woman driven by raw emotional passion. She was a cold, calculating predator addicted to control, status, and absolute financial dominance. The terror of watching her stolen fortune evaporate overnight, of seeing years of meticulous planning unravel without a single word of warning, would be a psychological torture far worse than any physical confrontation. Panic would override her caution, forcing her to cut her international trip short to salvage what she believed was slipping through her fingers. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the blinking terminal confirmation lights, the tension in his shoulders finally giving way to a cold, sharp resolve.
He didn't smile, but his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man watching the foundation of his prison finally give way. She's staring at her phone right now, and by tomorrow morning, the hunter is going to realize she just ran straight into a cage. He was right. Within 90 minutes of the federal freeze notification hitting her secure device, a flight manifest change registered across international travel databases. Catherine had canceled her remaining schedule at the Global Medical Investment Summit in Zurich, frantically booking an emergency seat back to the United States, cutting her 12-day trip short by 4 days. The trap was set, and our predator was flying home straight into the storm.
The heavy mahogany front door clicked open precisely at midnight, slicing through the deep silence of the house with a cold, metallic finality. I stood motionless in the pantry shadow, my breathing shallow, my eyes fixed on the surveillance monitor glowing in my palm. The woman who stepped across the threshold was a stranger to anyone who had ever seen her wave goodbye 4 days ago at the driveway. The warm, theatrical smile, the soft fragrance of perfume masking a calculated ambition, and the saintly mask of a devoted wife were completely stripped away. In their place stood a hardened stranger whose eyes scanned the dark living room with a ruthless calculation of an apex predator returning to a trap she believed was still safely sprung. She didn't call out for her husband, nor did she check the kitchen to see if I was awake. Her focus was entirely singular, driven by the panic of a white-collar criminal whose multi-million-dollar empire had inexplicably frozen over. Every square foot of the house was operating as a silent, unyielding witness under advanced technology. Months before, anticipating a day when legal facades would collapse, I had replaced our basic security grid with high-grade directional surveillance arrays and pinhole cameras. These weren't crude consumer gadgets that could be easily spotted. They were high-resolution infrared units integrated seamlessly into the architectural molding, streaming encrypted data packets directly through a fiber optic link to a secure cloud server maintained by the state's Financial Investigation Task Force. Every pixel of light, every movement, and every whispered sound was being captured in pristine fidelity, locked away beyond any future defense lawyer or corrupt magistrate. Catherine dropped her leather tote bag onto the entryway bench and strode directly into the study without taking off her coat. Her eyes were fixed instantly on the desk where my personal laptop rested. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with frantic speed, her breath hitching as she tried to bypass the security walls that now locked her completely out of every shell corporation, Cayman account, and real estate holding she had stolen. The panic radiating from her posture was palpable, the desperation of a wolf realizing the iron jaws had finally snapped shut around her leg. She stared at the flashing system error codes on the monitor, her face pale in the blue glare, her jaw tightening as the realization set in that her entire ill-gotten fortune had vanished behind an impenetrable wall of federal compliance blocks. Hearing a slight rustle from the hallway, Catherine snapped her head around and rushed out into the corridor, her heels clicking against the hardwood. She stopped dead at the entrance of the living room. There, sitting motionless in his wheelchair near the bay window, was Ethan. His head was slumped heavily against the headrest, his shoulders lax, his breathing slow in the exact mimicry of a man trapped deep within a chemical fog of sedatives. He was performing his final, most dangerous role in our script, maintaining the illusion of a broken, helpless invalid to keep the predator from realizing the trap had already been sprung. For 3 long seconds, the tension in the room was thick. Then, watching Ethan's slumped figure, Catherine visibly exhaled. The panic in her posture melted away, replaced by a cold, arrogant wave of relief.
She let out a short, dismissive breath, looking down at her husband with an expression of pure contempt that bared her true soul for the camera lenses. "Still breathing, are you?" she muttered, her voice dripping with venomous impatience as she stared at the man she planned to discard like trash. "Enjoy it while you still can. Your time is just about up." Without waiting for an answer from a man she believed was entirely brain-dead, Catherine turned and walked briskly into the kitchen. She set her designer bag on the marble island, unzipped it with ease, and reached inside. She pulled out a small medical pouch, extracting a preloaded glass syringe containing a clear biological fluid. This wasn't a crude poison designed to cause sudden agony. It was a sophisticated, slow-acting immunodepressant compound. It was chemically engineered to mimic the exact clinical markers of an aggressive autoimmune collapse, the precise cornerstone of the forged medical file she had bribed the Boston psychiatrist to approve, designed to orchestrate Ethan's quiet expiration by the end of next month. Through the hidden infrared lens mounted above the pantry, I watched her thumb gently test the plunger, easing a tiny droplet into the air with the chilling indifference of an executioner. She held the instrument of death between her fingers, completely unaware that every movement was being recorded, broadcast, and permanently etched into the legal evidence vault. The predator had brought her final weapon to the table, believing she was delivering a silent execution. She had no idea she was handing us the final signature on her own warrant, sealing her fate completely as the walls closed in around her.
The tiny droplet at the tip of the glass syringe trembled under the cold kitchen light, reflecting a split second where the entire universe seemed to hold its breath. Catherine leaned closer, her fingers steady, her eyes fixed on Ethan's arm with the clinical detachment of someone cleaning out a broken appliance. 1 millimeter more, and the slow-acting immunodepressant would have breached his bloodstream, sealing a murder disguised as an organic biological collapse. There was no room for error, no second chance, and no margin for theatrical delays. But before the needle could cross that final invisible line, the heavy silence of the kitchen was broken not by a gunshot or a shouted warning, but the quiet, disciplined click of the smart lock disengaging from the outside. We had designed the takedown to be an exercise in absolute surgical precision, avoiding the chaotic, high-speed battering rams that often turn routine rescue missions into volatile hostage tragedies. Instead of a loud, destructive police raid that could have prompted a desperate cornered predator to lash out, a specialized federal financial task force unit and the Massachusetts State Police Bureau approached the house in total stealth. They didn't break down the solid oak front door with axes or flashbangs. They used an authorized electronic override key, synced directly with the emergency compliance protocols I had initiated from the terminal earlier that night, to slip past the deadbolts without a single whisper of mechanical resistance, ensuring Ethan was never placed in the line of physical danger. 3 veteran investigators moved through the dark hallway like shadows, gliding across the hardwood with practiced coordination. Before Catherine's thumb could depress the plunger, strong arms caught her wrists from behind, twisting her hands upward with sudden, unyielding force. The glass syringe dropped from her fingers, shattering silently against the marble island tile as the steel cuffs snapped shut around her wrists with a sharp metallic bite that echoed through the quiet home. There was no theatrical screaming, no frantic flailing, and no desperate denial in the initial second of capture. Catherine simply froze, her body stiffening, before a cold, arrogant smirk slowly curved across her lips.
Her eyes flashed with calculated contempt as she tilted her head back, preparing to lean on her high-priced corporate defense strategy, ready to weaponize her legal rights, invoke her privilege of silence, and spit out rehearsed accusations about an unstable family conspiring to frame a devoted, grieving wife. She opened her mouth, her voice dripping with venomous self-assurance, fully convinced that her legal armor was still impenetrable against a domestic dispute. "You're making the biggest mistake of your career," she whispered, her voice sharp and cutting as glass, looking straight at the federal agents with absolute disdain. "Your attorneys won't be saving you this time, Catherine," I said quietly, stepping out from the deep shadows of the pantry corridor into the overhead light. My voice was steady, stripped of all the maternal grief and forced patience I had carried for the past 5 agonizing years. With measured steps, I walked across the kitchen floor, my eyes locked directly onto hers, letting the full weight of justice settle over the room. Without a word, I reached into my coat pocket, placed my personal tablet flat on the marble island right beside the shattered glass of the syringe, and tapped the screen. The instant the room filled with the crystal-clear audio playback of her own voice recorded only moments ago in the study, confessing to the manipulated bank accounts, the bribed medical boards, and the systematic execution plan. Right beside the audio player, the screen displayed a real-time forensic ledger containing every single authenticated wire transfer, offshore shell company registry, and the signed bribery receipts linking her directly to the modified Boston hospital records. The smirk on Catherine's face vanished in an instant, replaced by a pale, hollow look of absolute, irreversible defeat as she stared down at the digital blueprint of her entire empire collapsing into dust. The game of deception she had played for 5 long years was finally over, and the cage she built had locked shut around her forever.
The courtroom of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court was packed to suffocation, the air thick with the heavy, tense quiet that precedes an absolute legal reckoning. 10 months had crawled by since the midnight takedown in our kitchen, months spent wading through mountains of forensic digital ledgers, medical board depositions, and federal asset liquidation files. There was no room left for theatrical weeping, no clever legal maneuvering, and no hidden loopholes for a predator who had traded human life for corporate stock. When Catherine walked into the oak-paneled chamber dressed in standard federal prison orange, her head remained stubbornly unbowed, her eyes flashing with a cold, desperate defiance as she scanned the jury box, still looking for a loophole that no longer existed. The prosecution's case was built like a stone fortress, brick by undeniable brick, anchored entirely by the irrefutable paper trail and forensic audit data I had compiled from the shadows. But the defining moment of the trial came not from my testimony or the federal expert witnesses, but from the center of the courtroom itself. When the presiding judge called for the next witness, the heavy double doors at the back opened, and Ethan stepped forward. He did not use a wheelchair, nor did he lean on a pair of metal crutches. Moving with a deliberate, hard-won grace, he walked steadily across the polished hardwood floor on his own 2 feet, his posture upright and unbroken as he took his seat at the witness stand. The collective gasp that rippled through the gallery was absolute. In a single, silent heartbeat, 5 years of fabricated medical falsehoods and forced paralysis were utterly vaporized before the eyes of the court. When Ethan spoke, his voice did not tremble with anger or self-pity. It carried the calm, crushing weight of absolute truth. He looked directly at the woman who had poisoned his coffee, altered his medical records, and locked him inside a living tomb, detailing every calculated drop of chemical suppression and every midnight hour spent forcing his withered muscles to remember how to stand. He didn't scream or hurl insults. He simply laid out the mechanics of a slow-motion murder attempt with the cold precision of an engineer presenting a fatal structural flaw. Catherine sat frozen at the defense table, her arrogant smirk finally dissolving into a pale, hollow mask of terror as she realized the man she thought she had buried alive had returned from the grave to deliver her sentence. The verdict, when it finally was handed down by the panel of judges, left no room for mercy. The court declared Catherine guilty on all counts of large-scale financial fraud, systematic medical tampering, and organized conspiracy to commit premeditated murder, sentencing her to 35 years behind bars without the possibility of parole. The corrupt trauma surgeon from Boston, who had altered Ethan's original records, received an 18-year federal sentence of his own, sealing the fate of a conspiracy built on greed. As the bailiffs cuffed Catherine and led her away through the side exit, she kept her eyes glued to the floor, her $20 million empire entirely stripped away, leaving her stranded in the very prison of consequences she had manufactured. Yet true justice, as I came to learn through the long shadow of those years, is never really about the finality of a prison sentence or the cold satisfaction of a courtroom victory. It is about the quiet, agonizing process of reclaiming your life from the ashes. Months after the trial concluded, the noise of the legal battles faded into a distant memory, replaced by the warm, amber glow of a Georgia sunset stretching across our front porch. We didn't rush back into the frantic pace of high-stakes corporate architecture or chase the ghosts of the past. Ethan spent his days working with his hands again, sitting quietly at a wooden drafting table on the porch, designing small, sturdy homes for people rebuilding their lives after catastrophe. I watched him from the rocking chair beside him, listening to the soft rustle of the pine trees overhead and the distant chirping of evening birds, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace settle over my bones for the first time in over half a decade. The nightmare was over, the debt had been paid, and the dark winter of our lives had finally given way to a quiet, hard-earned spring. As the fading sunlight washed over the wooden railings, I looked out towards the horizon, letting the final, enduring truth of our journey settle deep into the quiet air for anyone listening in the dark. I said softly, letting the words carry the heavy, hard-won wisdom of a mother who had walked through the fire. The most dangerous wounds in this life never come from enemies holding knives in the open. They come from the people we hand our complete trust to in the dark. But always remember, true justice never sleeps. It simply waits for those patient enough to turn the pages until every hidden number reveals the truth. The screen faded to black, leaving the quiet hum of the night behind us.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.